about the effect of education, or the lack of it, on our nature, there's another comparison we can make. Picture human beings living in some sort of underground cave dwelling, with an entrance which is long, as wide as the cave, and open to the light. Here they live from earliest childhood, with their legs and necks in chains, so that they have to stay where they are, looking only ahead of them, prevented by the chains from turning their heads. They have light from a distant fire, which is burning behind them and above them. Between the fire and the prisoners, at a higher level than them, is a path along which you must picture a low wall that has been built, like the screen which hides people when they're giving a puppet show, and above which they make the puppets appear. Yes, I can picture all that, he said. Picture also, along the length of the wall, people carrying all sorts of manufactured objects which project above it. Statues of people, animals made of stone and wood, and all kinds of materials. As you'd expect, some of the people carrying the objects are speaking while others are silent. A strange picture, and strange prisoners. No more strange than us, I said. Do you think, for a start, that prisoners of that sort have ever seen anything more of themselves and of one another than the shadows cast by the fire on the wall of the cave in front of them? How could they, if they'd been prevented from moving their heads all their lives? What about the objects which are being carried? Wouldn't they see only shadows of these also? Yes, of course. So, if they were able to talk to one another, don't you think they'd believe that the things they were giving names to were the things they could see passing? Yes, they'd be bound to. What if the prison had an echo from the wall in front of them? Every time one of the people passing by spoke, do you suppose they'd believe the source of the sound to be anything other than the passing shadow? No, that's exactly what they would think. All in all, then, what people in this situation would take for truth would be nothing more than the shadows of the manufactured objects. Necessarily. Suppose nature brought this state of affairs to an end, I said. Think what their release from their chains and the cure for their ignorance would be like. When one of them was untied and compelled suddenly to stand up, turn his head, start walking, and look towards the light, he'd find all these things painful. Because of the glare, he'd be unable to see things whose shadows he used to see before. What do you suppose he'd say if he was told that what he used to see before was of no importance, whereas now his eyesight was better, since he was closer to what is, and looking at things which more truly are? Suppose further that each of the passing objects was pointed out to him, and that he was asked what it was and compelled to answer. Don't you think he'd be confused? Wouldn't he believe the things he saw before to be more true than what was being pointed out to him now? Yes, he would. Much more true. If he was forced to look at the light itself, wouldn't it hurt his eyes? Wouldn't he turn away and run back to the things he could see? Wouldn't he think those things really were clearer than what was being pointed out? Yes, he said. And if he was dragged out of there by force, up the steep and difficult path, with no pause until he'd been dragged right into the sunlight, wouldn't he find this dragging painful? Wouldn't he resent it? And when he came into the light, with his eyes filled with the glare, would he be able to see a single one of the things people call real? No, he wouldn't. Not at first. He'd need to acclimatize himself, I imagine, if he were going to see things up there. To start with, he'd find shadows the easiest things to look at. After that, reflections of people and other things in water. The things themselves would come later, and from those he would move on to the heavenly bodies and the heavens themselves. He'd find it easier to look at the light of the stars and the moon by night than look at the sun and the light of the sun by day. Of course. The last thing he'd be able to look at, presumably, would be the sun. Not its image in water or some location that is not its own, but the sun itself. He'd be able to look at it by itself, in its own place, and see it as it really was. Yes, he said, that would unquestionably be the last thing he'd be able to look at. At that point, he would work out that it was the sun which caused the seasons and the years, which governed everything in the visible realm, and which was, in one way or another, responsible for everything they used to see. That would obviously be the next stage. Now, suppose he were reminded of the place where he lived originally, of what passed for wisdom there, and of his former fellow prisoners. Don't you think he would congratulate himself on the change? Wouldn't he feel sorry for them? Indeed he would. Back in the cave, they might have had rewards and praises and prizes for the person who was quickest at identifying the passing shapes, who had the best memory for the ones which came earlier or later or simultaneously, and who, as a result, was best at predicting what was going to come next. Do you think he would feel any desire for these prizes? Would he envy those who were respected and powerful there, or would he feel as Achilles does in Homer? Would he much prefer to labor as a common serf, serving a man with nothing to his name, putting up with anything to avoid holding those opinions and living that life? Yes, he said. If you ask me, he'd be prepared to put up with anything to avoid that way of life. There's another question I'd like to ask you, I said. Suppose someone like that came back down into the cave and took up his old seat. Wouldn't he find, coming straight in from the sunlight, that his eyes were swamped by the darkness? I'm sure he would. And suppose he had to go back to distinguishing the shadows in competition with those who had never stopped being prisoners. Before his eyes had grown accustomed to the dark, while he still couldn't see properly, and this period of acclimatization would be anything but short, wouldn't he be a laughingstock? Wouldn't it be said of him that he'd come back from his journey to the upper world with his eyesight destroyed, and that it wasn't worth even trying to go up there? As for anyone who tried to set them free and take them up there, if they could somehow get their hands on him and kill him, wouldn't they do just that? They certainly would, he said. That is the picture then, my dear Glaucon, and it fits what we were talking about earlier in its entirety. The region revealed to us by sight is the prison dwelling, and the light of the fire inside the dwelling is the power of the sun. If you identify the upward path and the view of things above with the ascent of the soul to the realm of understanding, then you will have caught my drift, my surmise, which is what you wanted to hear. Whether it is really true, perhaps only God knows. My own view, for what it's worth, is that in the realm of what can be known, the thing seen last, and seen with great difficulty, is the form or character of the good. But when it is seen, the conclusion must be that it turns out to be the cause of all that is right and good for everything. In the realm of sight, it produces light, and light's sovereign, the sun, while in the realm of thought, it is itself sovereign, producing truth and reason unassisted. I further believe that anyone who's going to act wisely, either in private life or in public life, must have had a sight of this form of the good. Well, I for one agree with you, he said, as far as I can follow at any rate. Can you agree with me then on one further point? It's no wonder if those who have been to the upper world refuse to take an interest in everyday affairs, if their souls are constantly eager to spend their time in that upper region. Is what you'd expect, presumably, if things really are like the picture we've just drawn. Yes, it's what you'd expect. And here's another question. Do you think it's at all surprising if a person who turns to everyday life after the contemplation of the divine cuts a sorry figure and makes a complete fool of himself, if before he can see properly or can get acclimatized to the darkness around him, he is compelled to compete in the law courts or anywhere else about the shadows of justice, or the statues which cast those shadows, or to argue about the way they are understood by those who have never seen justice itself? No, it's not in the least surprising, he said. Anyone with any sense, I said, would remember that people's eyesight can be impaired in two quite different ways, and for two quite different reasons. There's the change from light to darkness, and the change from darkness to light. He might then take it that the same is true of the soul, so that when he saw a soul in difficulties, unable to see, he would not laugh mindlessly, but would ask whether it had come from some brighter life and could not cope with the unfamiliar darkness, or whether it had come from greater ignorance into what was brighter and was now dazzled by the glare. One he would congratulate on what it had seen and on its way of life, the other he would pity, or if he chose to laugh at it, his laughter would be less absurd than laughter directed at the soul which had come from the light above. Yes, what you say is entirely reasonable. Well, I said, if it's true, there's one conclusion we can't avoid. Education is not what some people proclaim it to be. What they say, roughly speaking, is that they are able to put knowledge into souls where none was before, like putting sight into eyes which were blind. Yes, that is what they say. Whereas our present account indicates that this capacity in every soul, this instrument by means of which each person learns, is like an eye which can only be turned away from the darkness and towards the light by turning the whole body. The entire soul has to turn with it, away from what is coming to be, until it is able to bear the sight of what is, and in particular, the brightest part of it. This is the part we call the good, isn't it? Yes. It is up to us, then, as founders of the city, to compel the best natures to get as far as that study which we said earlier was the most important, to make that ascent and view the good. And when they have made it, and seen all they need to see, we must not allow them to do what they are allowed to do at the moment. What is that? Remain there, I said, and refuse to come back down again to the prisoners we were talking about, or share in their hardships and rewards, be they trivial or substantial. That seems very unfair. Are we going to make them live a worse life when it is in their power to live a better one? Now it's your turn to have forgotten, my friend, that the law does not exist for the exclusive benefit of one class in the city. Its aim is to engineer the benefit of the city as a whole, using persuasion and compulsion to bring the citizens into harmony and making each class share with the other classes the contribution it is able to bring to the community. The law is what puts people like this in the city, and it does so not for the intention of allowing each of them to go his own way, but so that it can make use of them for its own purposes, to bind the city together. True, he said, I had forgotten that. In which case, Glaucon, you should bear in mind that we won't after all be doing an injustice to those who become philosophers in our city. There will be justice in what we say to them when we compel them to look after and guard what belongs to other people. It is fair enough, we shall say to them, for philosophers in other cities not to take a share of the work in those cities. Their philosophy is a spontaneous growth which arises despite the institutions of the particular city they live in, and what has developed naturally, indebted to nobody for its upbringing, is entitled to be unenthusiastic about paying anyone for its upbringing. But with you, it's different. We produced you as guides and rulers, both to yourselves and to the rest of the city, like leaders or kings in a hive of bees. You have been better and more fully educated than the rest, and are better able to play your part in both types of life, so you must go down, each of you in turn, to join the others in their dwelling place. You must get used to seeing in the dark, and when you do get used to it, you will see 1,000 times better than the people there do. You will be able to identify all the images there, and know what they are images of, since you have seen the truth of what is beautiful and just and good. In this way, the government of the city, for us and for you, will be a waking reality, rather than the kind of dream in which most cities exist nowadays, governed by people fighting one another over shadows, and quarrelling with one another about ruling, as if ruling were some great good. The truth is, I imagine, that the city in which those who are to rule are most reluctant to do so will inevitably be the city which has the best and most stable government, whereas the city with rulers of the opposite kind will have a government of the opposite kind. Exactly, he said. they disobey us then, do you think? These people we have brought up? Will they refuse to do their share of work in the city, each group in its turn, even though they can still spend most of their time in each other's company in the clear air above? They can't possibly refuse. It's a just demand, and they are just people. But they will undoubtedly approach ruling, each one of them, as something unavoidable, just the opposite of the people who rule in every city at the moment. That's right, my friend. It's like this. If you can find a better life than ruling for the people who are going to be your rulers, then your well-governed city becomes a possibility. It will be the only city ruled by those who are truly rich, not rich in money, but in a good and wise life. The rich is needed for good fortune. If you get beggars, people who are starved of good things in their own lives, going into public life because they believe that the good is something to be taken from there as plunder, then your city is not a possibility. Ruling becomes something to be fought over, and a war of this kind, domestic and internal, destroys both those involved in it and the rest of the city with them. Very true, he said. All right then. Can you think of any life apart from the life of true philosophy which has a contempt for public office? Good heavens, no. But ruling must be courted only by those who are not in love with her. Otherwise, they will have rival suitors to contend with. Of course. And if you're going to compel people to enter upon the guardianship of the city, who better than those who are wisest in these matters, in what will give the city the best government, and who have their own rewards and their own way of life, better than the political? There is no one better